They came out of the houses like ghosts, skeleton thin, eyes too big for their faces, children with bloated bellies, old men who had buried their wedding rings in the garden 5 years before so the Germans would not find them. They came pouring into the streets, into the ruined squares, into the cobbled lanes of cities they had not been allowed to call their own since the spring of 1940. And when they saw the iron shapes rolling toward them, they did not run. They ran toward them. These were not the practiced cheers of a staged welcome. These were not the polite waves of a grateful population. The Dutch did something in the spring of 1945 that has no clean parallel in the entire history of the Second World War. They climbed onto Sherman tanks while the engines were still hot. They kissed soldiers who had not bathed in weeks. They sang their forbidden national anthem at the top of their lungs while standing on the deck plates of armoured cars. They poured into the streets of Apeldoorn and Utrecht and Leeuwarden and Amsterdam in numbers so dense that Canadian commanders had to fire their pistols into the air just to clear a path for the column. And they did this for one specific army. Not for the Americans who liberated the southern provinces, but moved on quickly to the German border. Not for the British who fought beside them, but whose units pressed east into the Reich. They did this for the Canadians. The men with the maple leaf on their shoulders. The men who came across an ocean from a country most Dutch civilians had never seen on a map. This is the story of why. Why the Dutch reaction to Canadian liberators became one of the most extraordinary scenes of mass joy ever recorded in the 20th century. Why a small country at the edge of a flooded continent fell so completely in love with a small army from the other side of the Atlantic that the bond has lasted 80 years and counting. Why, every single year, the Dutch send tens of thousands of tulip bulbs to a city called Ottawa. And why this love story, beautiful as it is, was paid for in a currency so terrible that we have to walk through the darkness before we can see the light. To understand what happened in those Dutch streets, we have to understand what had been happening behind closed doors for the 5 years before. Most people picture the Second World War in the Netherlands as a long, grey occupation. A nuisance, a period of rationing and curfews. The reality was something far worse. By the autumn of 1944, the western half of the Netherlands had become one of the cruelest places to be a civilian on the European continent. The Dutch government in exile, broadcasting from London on a station called Radio Oranje, called for a national railway strike on September 17th, 1944. The strike was meant to support the Allied airborne operation at Arnhem called Market Garden. When that operation failed, the German occupation authorities retaliated by cutting off food shipments to the western provinces. The order, issued in late September with the consent of Reichskommissar Arthur Seyss-Inquart, sealed the western Netherlands off from the farms of the east. The roughly 4.5 million people of the Randstad, the great urban core that includes Amsterdam, Rotterdam, The Hague and Utrecht, were left to face the winter on whatever they had. What followed has a name in the Dutch language: Hunger Winter. The Hunger Winter. By the end of November of that year, the official adult food ration in Amsterdam had fallen below 1,000 calories a day. By late February of 1945, in some areas it had collapsed to roughly 580 calories. People burned their furniture for fuel. They burned books. They tore up wooden railway sleepers. They ate sugar beets, meant for cattle. They ate tulip bulbs, which Dutch nutrition authorities published recipes for that winter, including a tulip bulb soup, a tulip bulb biscuit, and a tulip bulb stew. They ate the family dog. They ate the family cat. They ate grass. Women and children would set off on bicycles, often with garden hoses or wooden rims, because there were no rubber tyres left in the country. They would ride 60, 80, 100 kilometres across the icy flats to beg or barter for a few potatoes from a farmer they had never met. The Dutch called these journeys hunger trips. Many people who set out never came home. The accepted death toll for the hunger winter is around 18,000 to 22,000 Dutch civilians. They died in their kitchens. They died on the floors of train stations. They died in their beds, often quietly, with their children watching. By April of 1945, the soup kitchens of the Western Netherlands were feeding millions of people every day, and the soup itself had thinned to a trickle of vegetable water. It was not enough to keep a working adult alive. This is the country the Canadians were marching toward. This is the population that would, in just a few weeks, come pouring out of those houses. Knowing this changes everything about what those crowds did when they saw the tanks. Now we have to understand who the Canadians were, not the polished image, the reality. The 1st Canadian Army, the formation that did the actual liberating, was commanded by Lieutenant General Henry Duncan Graham Crerar, who was usually called Harry. By April of 1945, this army had grown to more than 450,000 men. Of those, about 175,000 were Canadians. The rest were British, Polish, Belgian, Dutch, Czech, and at various points American. It was, by a wide margin, the largest field army that any Canadian general has ever commanded. Inside it were 2 Canadian corps. The 1st Canadian Corps, under Lieutenant General Charles Foulkes, had just been transferred up from Italy through an operation called Goldflake. It included the 1st Canadian Infantry Division, the 5th Canadian Armoured Division, and the 1st Canadian Armoured Brigade. The 2nd Canadian Corps, under Lieutenant General Guy Granville Simons, included the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th Canadian Divisions. These men were not green. They had fought through Sicily. They had fought through the meat grinder of the Italian campaign at places like Ortona. They had landed at Juno Beach on D-Day. They had bled their way through Normandy. They had spent the autumn of 1944 wading waist-deep through the freezing salt marshes of the Scheldt estuary in Belgium and the southern Netherlands, taking more than 6,000 casualties just to open the port of Antwerp. By the time they crossed into the Dutch heartland in April of 1945, these were some of the most experienced infantrymen in the entire Allied coalition. But they had something else. They were willing to fight in cities while holding back. The standard Allied solution to a built-up area defended by Germans was straightforward. Pull back the infantry, call in the bombers, call in the heavy artillery, flatten the place, then walk through the rubble. In Dutch towns, the Canadians often refused to do this. The cost in soldiers' lives was higher, the danger was greater, but the cities were spared. Groningen, the largest urban battle the Canadians fought in the Netherlands, was cleared by infantry and supporting tanks, while artillery fire was specifically restricted out of concern for civilians. 5 times as many Canadians fought in direct combat at Groningen as had fought at Ortona, and yet much of the city's medieval core survived because of decisions made by men in command tents who could have made the easier choice and did not. This is part of the answer, but only part. The first crucible was the Igesel River and the city of Apeldoorn. The operation had a brutal nickname: Cannon Shot. On April 11, 1945, in the late afternoon, the first amphibious vehicles of the 1st Canadian Infantry Division entered the river. These were tracked landing craft called Buffaloes, 27 of them, each carrying a platoon of infantry. The Germans on the far bank fired everything they had. By around 11 o'clock that same evening, Canadian engineers, working under fire, had completed a pontoon bridge across the icy water. Soldiers who built it gave it more than one nickname, but the one that stuck in the regimental memory was the Can of Worms. The 48th Highlanders of Canada led the 1st Brigade across. The 1st Division pushed on through woods and over canals against German paratroopers and infantry who fought a delaying action. By April 17, after 6 days of combat and more than 500 casualties, including more than 100 killed, the city of Apeldoorn was free. What happened next was recorded in the war diary of the Hastings and Prince Edward Regiment. The men who marched into Apeldoorn on April the 17th wrote that the going was tough due to the cheering and crowding of the thousands of liberated Dutch people who crowded the streets and showered bouquets of flowers on the troops. A good-looking soldier, the diary continued, had to use his weapon to beat off the girls, and many a fair maiden's kiss was forced on the boys. A Canadian captain in that regiment, a man who would later become one of Canada's most famous writers, was Farley Mowat. Mowat described entering a city that was waiting for liberation and was half crazed with its own emotion. The enemy had already gone. The only shots being fired, he wrote, were those his commanding officer fired into the air from his pistol just to try to clear a path through the civilian throngs. That is one street in one city on one afternoon. The same scene played out with local variations in town after town that spring. The second crucible was a city called Zwolle, and what happened there is one of the strangest single soldier stories of the entire war. On the night of April 13, 1945, a Canadian private named Léo Major and his friend Corporal Wilfrid Arsenault, both of the Régiment de la Chaudière, volunteered to scout the city. Zwolle had a population of around 50,000 and was held by a German garrison of unknown size. The plan was for the Canadian artillery to flatten the city the next morning if the Germans did not pull out. Major and Arsenault crossed the railway tracks in the dark. A German machine gun opened up. Arsenault was killed. Major lost his second friend that day. He was already a man who was missing the use of one eye from a phosphorus grenade earlier in the campaign and had refused to be evacuated. Now he was alone, in a hostile city with his friend's body behind him and a plan to call in artillery on the heads of 50,000 civilians at dawn. He decided to keep going. For the next several hours, by his own account and the accounts of those who served with him, Major moved through the streets of Zwolle, firing his Steen gun in long bursts, throwing grenades, and creating the impression of a far larger force. He set fire to the local Gestapo headquarters. He encountered a German officer and, through a mix of bluff and circumstance, convinced him that resistance was hopeless. The German garrison, hearing gunfire and explosions from every direction, withdrew before dawn. By the morning of April 14, when the Régiment de la Chaudière entered the city, Zwolle was in Dutch hands. The artillery bombardment was cancelled. Léo Major was awarded the Distinguished Conduct Medal for his actions that night. He would later receive a second Distinguished Conduct Medal for his service in Korea on Hill 355 in 1951, becoming the only Canadian soldier ever to receive that decoration in 2 different wars. He was made an honorary citizen of Zwolle in 2005. There is a street there named Léo Majolan. He died in 2008 in Quebec and is buried at the National Field of Honour at Pointe-Claire. Some of the colourful details of his solo run through Zwolle have been embellished over the decades, including by Major himself in different retellings, but the core fact remains. One Canadian soldier, half-blind, alone, walked into a city of 50,000 people in the middle of the night and walked out the next morning with that city free. The third crucible was the bleakest. On April the 12th, 1945, units of the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division, including the South Saskatchewan Regiment and the 8th Reconnaissance Regiment of the 14th Canadian Hussars, reached a place in the eastern Netherlands called Camp Westerbork. Westerbork was a transit camp. The Germans had used it to deport more than 100,000 Jews and Roma and Sinti from the Netherlands to the death camps in the east. Anne Frank and her sister Margot had been on the final transport from Westerbork to Auschwitz on September 3, 1944. Of the more than 100,000 Dutch Jews who passed through that camp, only a small fraction returned. When the Canadians arrived, 876 prisoners were still alive inside the wire. A Dutch civil servant named Adrianus van Ass, known as Aard, was inside the camp when the gates opened. The prisoners draped an orange sash around his shoulders. They handed him a Dutch flag and the orange flag of the House of Orange-Nassau. They sang the Wilhelmus, the song the Germans had banned for 5 years. The act of singing it openly in a camp where so many had died for the crime of being Dutch and Jewish was an act of national resurrection. The Wilhelmus is the world's oldest national anthem melody, dating from around 1568, and the Canadians were standing right there in the middle of it. Now we have to talk about the food. By late April of 1945, the Western Netherlands was on the edge of a complete civilizational collapse. The Canadian advance had liberated the eastern provinces, but the Randstad was still in German hands. Roughly 4.5 million Dutch civilians were trapped behind the Grebbe line, a defensive position the Germans were prepared to hold to the last bullet. If the Canadians attacked, the Germans had threatened to flood the country by blowing the dikes. Both sides knew that an opposed assault into the Randstad would kill tens of thousands of civilians who were already starving to death. So instead, something almost without precedent in the entire war happened. The two enemies sat down to negotiate. On April 28th, at a place called Achterveld, Canadian and German officers met under a flag of truce. Prince Bernhard, the husband of Princess Juliana and the commander-in-chief of the Dutch interior forces, had personally appealed to General Eisenhower to do something to save his people. The combined chiefs of staff in Washington had authorized Eisenhower to open negotiations on April 23. The Royal Air Force Air Commodore Andrew Geddes drew up the operational plans. On April 29th, a Royal Air Force Lancaster bomber, nicknamed Bad Penny, took off as a test flight. The crew had 7 men. 5 of them were from Ontario, including the pilot, Robert Upcott of Windsor. They flew very low, by some accounts as low as 50 feet, over German anti-aircraft batteries. The German guns did not fire. The agreement was holding. What followed over the next 11 days was Operation Manna by the Royal Air Force, Operation Chowhound by the United States Army Air Forces, and Operation Faust by the 1st Canadian Army. Bombers that had spent 6 years dropping high explosive on German cities now flew over Dutch cities at low altitude and dropped welfare biscuits, canned meat, condensed milk, sugar, salt, dried egg, dried peas, margarine, cheese, yeast, potatoes, and cigarettes. 3,156 Lancaster sorties. 2,268 Boeing B-17 sorties. The drop zones were specific. The Duindicht racecourse near The Hague, the Valkenburg airfield near Katwijk, Ypenburg, the Walhaven district of Rotterdam, the Kralingseeplas, Gouda. Operation Faust was the Canadian ground component. At 7:30 in the morning on May 2, 360 Allied trucks crossed the German lines under the truce. 8 Canadian transport platoons and 4 British platoons of the Royal Canadian Army Service Corps drove their loads to a transshipment point in the no man's land between Wageningen and Rhenen, a flat stretch the locals called the Nude. Dutch civilian drivers picked the cargo up and carried it forward into the cities. By May 3, vehicles were crossing the line every minute. The combined tonnage delivered in those 11 days was roughly 18,000 tons of food. A Canadian writer named Farley Mowat, that same captain from Apeldoorn, was present during some of the negotiations. Canadian veterans of the convoys remembered Dutch civilians who came out to unload the trucks, but were too weak from starvation to lift the boxes, and German soldiers, still officially the enemy, being conscripted to help. The Dutch wrote messages on their roofs. "Thank you, Canadians. Many thanks." Out in the tulip fields, bulb growers spelled out the words, "Many thanks," in living tulips, so that the bombers would see them on the next pass. The end came at a hotel. On May 4, at Lüneburg Heath in Germany, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery accepted the surrender of all German forces in northwest Europe. It would take effect at 8 in the morning on May 5. But the German forces inside the Netherlands, around 120,000 men, under General Oberst Johannes Blaskowitz, needed a separate detailed surrender to a senior Canadian officer. That officer was Lieutenant General Charles Volkers. The town chosen was Wageningen. The building was a modest hotel called the Hotel de Wereld. The town had been evacuated and was largely empty. At 4 in the afternoon on May 5, 1945, Blaskowitz arrived with his chief of staff, General Lieutenant Paul Reichelt. Volkers was waiting. So was Brigadier General George Kitching. So was Prince Bernhard, the husband of Princess Juliana, the man whose newborn daughter had been protected on Canadian soil 2 years earlier. Volks presented the orders for the surrender of all German forces inside the Netherlands. Blaskowitz asked for 24 hours to verify his own troop dispositions. The next day, May 6, the formal capitulation document was signed in the auditorium of the Agricultural College next door. The story, half believable and half charming, is that the signing was held there because nobody in the hotel could find a working typewriter the previous afternoon. The Canadian historian Tim Cook of the Canadian War Museum has described what Volks carried into that hotel. According to Cook, Volks had been appalled at what the Germans had accumulated and squirreled away in terms of paintings and French wine and chocolates, while the Netherlands was starving. When the German officers tried to slow-walk the agreement on food convoys, Cook says, Volkers growled at them and told them that withholding food at this point would be a war crime. The pen Blaskowitz used to sign the surrender is still preserved in a small museum in Wageningen. The town calls itself, to this day, the City of Liberation. Every year, on the night between May 4 and May 5, the mayor of Wageningen lights what the Dutch call the Liberation Fire on the hotel grounds. But there is one darker scene before we can get to the joy, because the joy was not a clean thing. It came soaked in blood that had not yet been wiped from the cobblestones. On May 7, 1945, 2 days after the surrender at Wageningen, an enormous crowd gathered in the centre of Amsterdam on a square called the Dam. The Canadians and their Allied partners were expected. A small reconnaissance party of armoured cars from the British 49th West Riding Division, a unit that fought under 1st Canadian Army Command, had passed through earlier that day and waved to the crowds. People had been pouring into the square for hours. Tens of thousands of them. Children on shoulders, old people in chairs, strangers hugging strangers. The orange flags of the House of Orange Nassau, hidden in attics for 5 years, were everywhere. Inside a building on the corner of the square, a building called the Groot Club, a unit of German Marines was still inside. The Marines had not yet been disarmed by the Allies. They had heard reports that Dutch resistance fighters were trying to disarm German soldiers nearby. Some accounts say they panicked. Other accounts suggest a deliberate decision. Either way, around 3 in the afternoon, machine guns opened up from the windows, the balcony, and the rooftop of the Groot Club, or they fired into the crowd. The shooting lasted roughly an hour and a half before a ceasefire was arranged. The official memorial foundation, the Stichting Memorial voor Damslachtoffers, has identified 32 Dutch civilians who died from the shooting. 25 died on May 7 itself. 4 more died of their wounds on May 8. 1 more on May 9. 1 on May 18. 1 as late as June 22. 8 of the dead were under 20 years old. The youngest victim was 8. The oldest was 74. More than 100 people were wounded. The Germans inside the Groot Club were rounded up by Canadians on May 9th. No perpetrator was ever formally tried. A pavement memorial of stones, each engraved with the name of a victim, was unveiled by Mayor Eberhard van der Laan in 2016. This is the texture of liberation. It was not a montage, it was not a parade. It was real, with real bullets, in real cities where real people died on the very day they were supposed to be free. And yet the joy still came. The crowds still mobbed the tanks. The Dutch still climbed onto the armour. Why did they react this way to these specific men? Part of the answer is hidden in a hospital in Ottawa. To find it, we have to go back 5 years. In May of 1940, when the German army crashed across the Dutch border, the Dutch royal family was forced to flee. Queen Wilhelmina escaped to Britain, where she would broadcast on Radio Oranje 34 times during the war, denouncing Adolf Hitler as the arch-enemy of mankind. Winston Churchill, who knew bravery when he saw it, reportedly described her as the only real man among the governments in exile. Her daughter, Crown Princess Juliana, escaped with her 2 small daughters, Beatrix and Irene, first to Britain and then by Dutch cruiser to Halifax in Canada in June 1940. The Earl of Athlone, Canada's Governor-General at the time, offered the family asylum. His wife, Princess Alice, was Juliana's great-aunt by marriage. The royal family settled first at Rideau Hall, then at 120 Lansdowne Road in the Rockcliffe Park neighbourhood of Ottawa, a house Juliana nicknamed Nooit Gedacht, which is Dutch for never imagined. From the summer of 1941, they lived at a house called Stornoway on Acacia Avenue, which today is the official residence of the Leader of the Opposition in Canada. Juliana enrolled her oldest daughter Beatrix in an Ottawa public school. By the accounts of those who knew her, she lived in Ottawa with notable informality, doing her own errands, taking the children out, behaving more like a neighbour than a head of state in waiting. Her husband, Prince Bernhard, who was training as a pilot with the Royal Air Force, visited when he could. In November of 1942, Juliana was pregnant with her 3rd child. There was a problem. Under the rules of Dutch royal succession, an heir to the throne born on foreign soil might not be considered fully Dutch. The Canadian government took the problem and solved it in a way that almost no other government in the world would have bothered to try. A legal advisor in the Department of External Affairs named John Erskine Reed, working with his Department of Justice, drafted a special enactment under the War Measures Act. The proclamation, signed by the Earl of Athlone, declared that the rooms in which Princess Juliana would give birth at the Ottawa Civic Hospital on Carling Avenue were, for the duration of her stay, extraterritorial. They were carved out of Canadian sovereignty. Inside that hospital ward, Canadian law would not apply. The child would be born outside Canada in a legal sense, even though physically she would be born in a hospital in the capital city of Canada. On January 18, 1943, Juliana was admitted to the hospital. The next day, January 19th, Princess Margriet Francisca was born. Her name in Dutch means daisy. The daisy had become a symbol of the Dutch resistance. The Canadian government did one more thing. The Dutch tricolour was raised on the Peace Tower of the Parliament of Canada. To this day, that is the only occasion in the history of the Canadian Parliament buildings on which a foreign flag has been flown from the Peace Tower itself. The carillon played Dutch songs. Crowds gathered. 5 months later, on June 29, 1943, baby Margriette was christened at St. Andrew's Presbyterian Church on Wellington Street in Ottawa. Her godparents were a list that captures the world she had been born into. United States President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, represented at the ceremony by an American diplomat. Queen Mary, the widow of King George V, represented by the Earl of Athlone, the entire Dutch merchant marine represented at the front of the church by 7 sailors, and a Dutch widow named Martine Ruel. The christening was broadcast worldwide on shortwave. Prince Bernhard, watching the political weather, advised the Dutch underground not to celebrate too openly. The Germans were listening. People were being shot for less, but Dutch resistance fighters listened in their attics. Mothers in Amsterdam and Rotterdam and The Hague heard the bells from a church in Ottawa. They heard the announcer say, "Princess Margaret." And in the darkest year of their occupation, in the year before the hunger winter would even begin, they were given a small reason to believe that their country had a future and that the future had a name. This is part of why. This is why the maple leaf meant something specific to a Dutch civilian in 1945 that an American flag or a British flag did not mean in the same way. The Canadians were not just liberators. They were the people who had taken in the royal family. They were the people whose government had bent the rules of sovereignty itself to make sure that a Dutch baby would be born Dutch. They were a friend the Dutch had already had for 5 years before the first Sherman tank rolled into Apeldoorn. If the Americans brought industry to the war and the British brought stubborn endurance, the Canadians brought a kind of intimate gravity that the Dutch could feel even before they could explain it. Now we have to compare the 3 armies because the Dutch reaction is impossible to understand without seeing the contrast. Consider first the Americans. The American army that landed in northwest Europe in 1944 was a force of overwhelming material weight. American infantry generally relied on the immense logistical tail of the United States to solve tactical problems. The standard answer to a strong point was an airstrike, an artillery preparation, a torrent of shells that flattened everything and let the infantry walk through afterward. In open country and against fanatical defenders, this method was often correct and saved many American lives. But it was also impersonal. The Americans liberated only the southern Netherlands, mostly the provinces of Limburg and North Brabant, and most American formations rolled on quickly into Germany. Consider next the British. The British Army of 1945 was the most experienced in the Western Coalition. They had been at war since September of 1939. They had endured Dunkirk. They had endured the Blitz. They had fought through North Africa and Italy. By the time they reached the Dutch border, they were extremely competent and extremely tired. Britain was running out of men. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's doctrine of bite and hold was disciplined and effective, but it was also cautious by design. The British soldiers in the Netherlands fought hard and respected the Dutch, but most British divisions, like most American divisions, eventually pressed on into Germany. They did not stay long enough for the bond to set. Then consider the Canadians. The Canadians had been in Britain training since 1940. They had absorbed the doctrine of the British Commonwealth and matched it with the can-do energy of a younger country. Their commanders, men like Crerar and Simmons and Folks, fought the Dutch campaign as a Canadian operation. The 1st Canadian Army was the Allied force whose final objective was the Netherlands itself. They did not move on. They could not. The hunger winter was happening in front of them. The food drops were happening because of them. The royal family was a Canadian responsibility in a way it was nobody else's. And so when the surrender came on May 5th, the Canadians did not pack up and go home. They stayed. This is the part that nobody talks about as much, but it is one of the keys to the entire story. The Canadian summer of 1945. The Canadian Army did not finish demobilizing out of the Netherlands until later in the year. Tens of thousands of Canadian soldiers spent the spring, the summer, and part of the fall in Dutch homes, on Dutch farms, in Dutch cafes, helping with reconstruction, distributing food, repairing infrastructure, and getting to know the Dutch population at a level no American or British formation in Northwest Europe ever did. This was when the deep bond was forged. Canadian soldiers were quartered with Dutch families. They sat at Dutch dinner tables. They taught Dutch children English words. They handed out chocolate that the children of Apeldoorn and Rotterdam and Utrecht had not tasted in 5 years. They danced with Dutch women in town squares. They grieved with Dutch families who had lost relatives in the camps. They became, in many cases, the first foreigners these Dutch civilians had ever truly known. About 1,886 Dutch women married Canadian servicemen in this period. They became Dutch war brides. They sailed to Halifax and Quebec City. They built lives in Vancouver and Calgary and Toronto and small farming towns from Nova Scotia to British Columbia. The future Canadian Senator Romeo Dallaire was the son of one such marriage. The number of children born to Dutch mothers and Allied fathers, mostly Canadian, in 1945 and 1946 is harder to count. Estimates run into the thousands. A popular Dutch song that summer was called Trees heeft een Canadees, which translates roughly as Trees has a Canadian. Trees was a common Dutch girl's name. The song was sung in cafes, at weddings, and in living rooms. It is still sung at certain Dutch family gatherings today. This is the texture that no other Allied army left behind. Not the Americans, not the British, not the Poles, not the French. Only the Canadians. There was one more thing. A small thing, in a way. A gift. In the autumn of 1945, a few months after she returned to a liberated Dutch soil with her family, Princess Juliana sent 100,000 tulip bulbs to the city of Ottawa as a personal thank you for the years of asylum and for the role of Canadian soldiers in liberating her country. The next year, in 1946, she sent another 20,500 bulbs with a request that some of them be planted on the grounds of the Ottawa Civic Hospital, the building where her daughter Margaret had been born. Every year since, the Dutch have continued to send tulip bulbs to Ottawa, tens of thousands annually divided between the royal family and the Dutch Bulb Growers Association. In 1952, the Ottawa photographer Malik Karsh, brother of the famous portrait photographer Yusuf Karsh, proposed to the Ottawa Board of Trade that the city should turn the annual blooming of these bulbs into a festival. The first Canadian Tulip Festival was held the following year, in 1953. Today it draws roughly 650,000 visitors and shows more than 1 million tulips around Dow's Lake and the city's parks. In 2002, Princess Margrethe herself unveiled a sculpture in Ottawa called The Man with Two Hats, a reference to the moment of liberation. An identical sculpture stands in the city of Apeldoorn. In 2020, for the 75th anniversary of liberation, the Dutch and Canadian partners launched a campaign to plant 1.1 million Orange Liberation 75 tulips across Canada, one tulip for every Canadian who had served in the Second World War. Now we have to talk about the price. More than 7,600 Canadian soldiers died liberating the Netherlands. They are buried in cemeteries with names that do not appear on most tourist maps, but which every Dutch schoolchild in certain regions knows by heart. Holton Canadian War Cemetery in Overijssel, which holds 1,355 Canadians among roughly 1,394 Commonwealth burials. Groesbeek Canadian War Cemetery in Gelderland near Nijmegen, which holds 2,338 Canadians and bears a memorial inscription in Latin that reads, in English, "We live in the hearts of friends for whom we died." Bergen op Zoom Canadian War Cemetery in North Brabant, which holds 968 Canadians among 1,118 Commonwealth burials. Adigum Canadian War Cemetery just over the border in Belgium, which holds around 840 Canadians, the largest concentration of Canadians Second World War dead in Belgium. April of 1945 alone, the month of the Great Dutch celebrations, was also the month in which more than 1,000 Canadians were killed. The Dutch never forgot. This is the part that astonishes Canadians who travel to the Netherlands for the first time even today. The Dutch grave adoption tradition began in 1945 at the American cemetery in Margraten in Limburg and spread quickly to the Canadian cemeteries. Today, every single Canadian grave at Holton and at Groesbeek is individually adopted by a Dutch family or a Dutch schoolchild who tends it, brings flowers, and researches the life story of the soldier buried there. On Christmas Eve every year since 1991 at Holton, the Dutch place a candle on every one of the Canadian graves. The cemetery glows in the winter dark. The candles are lit by people who never met the men they are honouring and whose grandparents, in many cases, were not born when those men died. When Canadian veterans return to Apeldoorn for the major liberation anniversaries, the cities along the parade route fill with ordinary Dutch citizens who line the curbs 10 and 20 deep. In 2025, for the 80th anniversary, more than 1,000 Canadian students participated in commemorative events. The honoured guests included a 101-year-old Canadian Honorary Lieutenant General named Richard Romer, a 102-year-old veteran from British Columbia named George Brewster, and a 100-year-old veteran named Jack Rossiter. Canadian veterans in their 90s and beyond have spoken in interview after interview about what it feels like to walk those Dutch streets again. Sergeant Herb Pike of the 48th Highlanders, who walked through Apeldoorn behind the lead companies in 1945, has said that the Dutch never forget what the Canadians did, and that they show it every time the veterans go over. And so we come back to the question we started with. Why did the Dutch react the way they did? Why did the crowds in Apeldoorn climb onto the tanks? Why did the children of Deventer ask for chocolate and cigarettes as an introduction to any other conversation, as the war diary of the Canadian Scottish Regiment recorded with a kind of bemused tenderness? Why did the Jewish survivors of Westerbork drape an orange sash over a Dutch civil servant and sing an anthem that had been illegal for 5 years? The answer is not one thing. It is a stack of things, each one true, and each one essential. The Hunger Winter had stripped the Western Netherlands down to the marrow. The food drops at low altitude had turned bombers from a sound of terror into a sound of life. The doctrine of restraint had spared cities like Groningen at the cost of higher Canadian casualties. The 7,600 Canadian dead had paid for every cobblestone in blood. Princess Margrethe had been born under the Dutch flag flying on the Peace Tower in Ottawa. Leo Major had walked through Zwolle in the dark to spare it from artillery. Charles Foulkes had stared down German officers across a hotel table because they were trying to delay food convoys to a starving population. The Canadian summer had kept young men at Dutch dinner tables for half a year. The war brides had carried the bond home to Canada. The children born 9 months later had grown into a Dutch-Canadian community more than 1 million strong. But more than any of those individual facts, it was a quality that was harder to name. The Canadians had crossed an ocean to fight a war that was not, strictly speaking, theirs. They could have stayed home. They had no Pearl Harbor, no bombing of London, no country directly invaded. They came anyway. And when they got to the Netherlands, the smallest and most easily forgotten corner of the Western Front, they did not flatten the cities. They did not move on quickly. They stayed. They fed people. They danced with them. They married them. They buried their friends in Dutch soil and let those friends remain there forever, under the candles of children who would not be born for another 50 years. The Dutch had spent 5 years living under a regime that classified them as objects to be exploited. And then one spring the world changed in a single afternoon. Tanks rolled into the square. Young men with maple leaves on their shoulders climbed out of them and handed children chocolate and lit cigarettes for old men whose hands were shaking too much to hold the matches. The flags came out of the attics, the anthem came out of the throats, the orange came out of the closets, and the whole country, for one absolutely irreplaceable moment, was simply free. That is what those crowds did when they first saw Canadian tanks in 1945. They poured out of their houses and gave themselves completely to the men they had decided would carry the rest of their gratitude for the next 80 years. And 80 years later, that gratitude has not faded. It has only deepened the way all real love does, into a quiet, permanent fixture of two national identities that found each other across an ocean and decided to stay close. The Russians had won. The Americans had won. The British had won. But the Canadians had come for them specifically with a kindness that did not belong to that war and never quite left. And once you have seen a kindness like that walking up your street with a maple leaf on its shoulder, you do not forget it. Not in your lifetime. Not in your children's lifetime. Not in 80 years. Maybe not ever.